From your favorite podcatchers and our YouTube channel featuring scenic videos, this is Kaijuvision Radio, Episode 16, Godzilla vs. Hedorah. Hello G-fans and kaiju lovers, and welcome to Kaijuvision Radio, a podcast about the appreciation of giant monster movies
and discovering their historical and cultural value.
I'm Brian Scherschel.
And I'm Nathan Marchand.
And in this episode, we'll be covering the wonderful Godzilla vs. Hedorah. What an amazing movie. This is such a unique film. So good. We're going to really get into this and see how much we can do.
Yeah, some of you may be more familiar with this under the title Godzilla vs. the Smog Monster. This is the beginning of an era of Godzilla films that aren't necessarily the most appreciated. Not a lot of fans like the 70s Godzilla films.
Yeah, this is their first 70s film. We've reached a different era almost.
Yeah.
We're in the same series still, the Showa series, but things really changed. But there's such a big difference between the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that with the next few episodes, we've been looking forward to a lot of the films from this era, and I'm hoping that we can shed some more light on these movies and help people to actually see that there's more going on with each one of the movies in this particular decade than you may have thought. Each one of these entries has something unique to talk about.
Our related topics for this episode are pollution and the resulting environmentalist movement in Japan and the Two Nixon Shocks. And so with that, we'll start with our short description of the film. Take it away, Nate. You're listening to Kaijuvision Radio.
Godzilla is the defender of the Earth. He comes to Japan to kill Hedorah, who threatens the environment. However, he shows no regard for collateral damage since humans sometimes die during his battles. He's more character than creature, displaying behavior such as posturing, taunting, and strategizing. Hedorah is an alien life form from a dark gaseous nebula who landed on Earth in a comet. He metamorphoses through several forms by consuming smog and other pollutants. His only motive is to feed. He displays anthropomorphism such as laughter and taunting while battling Godzilla. Ken Yano is a Japanese schoolboy who has unwavering faith in Godzilla. He assists with his father's research on Hedorah and witnesses many of the film's events. His father, Dr. Toru Yano, is scarred by Hedorah, which compels him to discover the monster's weakness before the creature wipes out humanity. Yukio Keiuchi, Dr. Yano's brother, and his girlfriend, Miki Fujiyama, are Japanese youth who are attacked by Hedorah and later stage a protest that becomes a hedonistic party. The human and kaiju plots are unified. Only on rare occasions do the characters' actions have nothing to do with the kaiju. They spend most of their time studying, avoiding, and/or battling the monsters. Godzilla fights Hedorah while the smog monster attacks a factory, the two of them retreating into the ocean. Hedorah attacks Tokyo while pursued by Godzilla. Dr. Yano tells the JSDF to construct two huge electrodes on Mount Fuji to kill Hedorah with high temperatures. But these lose power when the kaiju destroy power lines. The partying youth throw torches at Hedorah, who kills them all. The JSDF lures Hedorah between the electrodes using flashing headlights on trucks. Power is restored momentarily, but lost again. Godzilla powers the electrodes with his atomic ray. Hedorah barely survives the first dehydration and tries to escape, but Godzilla flies him back to the electrodes for a second dehydration. Godzilla rips Hedorah's body apart and dehydrates the pieces. The script co-written by Takeshi Kimura and director Yoshimitsu Banno is a simple and straightforward cautionary tale with a strong environmentalist message. The film had a 90 million yen budget, which was less than half of the money given to the 1960s Godzilla films. It was shot in 35 days with special effects handled by Teruyoshi Nakano. Despite tight schedules, the film features stylized animation sequences, a small but detailed miniature city, and Nakano's trademarked explosions. While the Godzilla suit from Destroy All Monsters was reused again, the multiple forms of Hedorah are all implemented quite well using puppets and suitmation. As with any Kimura script, the film is dark, cynical, and often disturbing. However, it's also surreal and includes moments of comic relief such as Godzilla's infamous flying scene. As for tone, it's the gravest film in the franchise since the original Gojira. The film is not as fantastical as it is just really out there. Hedorah was unlike any kaiju Godzilla had fought before in terms of design and execution. The film's trippy imagery and countercultural focus made it quite weird and unique. While the film is difficult to classify, it reinforces style elements from Gojira, Ebirah Horror of the Deep, and All Monsters Attack. It does so by featuring a dark tone, gruesome deaths, a scarred scientist, young people, a modern soundtrack, an unconventional story and monster, Godzilla as a character, humor, a director who tries new things, a child protagonist, and industrial settings. Banno originally conceived of the film after he saw cities like Yokkaichi overrun with smog and the ocean filled with foam from detergent. He wanted to make a movie that addressed the pollution plaguing Japan. Despite the presence of young adult characters and a child character, the film seems to be meant for a general audience. The film was released July 24, 1971 as part of the Summer Toho Champion Film Festival. It grossed 300 million yen with an attendance of 1.74 million, making it Toho's second best grossing film of the year and the fifth highest grossing Japanese film. It was released stateside by AIP as Godzilla vs. the Smog Monster in February 1972, sometimes on double bill with the horror film Frogs. It's a polarizing film for Godzilla fans who either love it or hate it. No footage was cut in the dub version, but shots with Japanese text were replaced with English or textless equivalents. The opening theme song, Return the Sun, was replaced with the ditty, Save the Earth. Hedorah feeds on Japan's rampant pollution. Counterculture youth feature prominently in the film. Japanese citizens are forced to wear gas masks to avoid breathing the sulfuric fumes emitted by Hedorah. Ken seems to have a psychic connection to Godzilla since he foresees his coming in dreams. Environmentalism was a huge timely theme because Japan found itself mired in pollution from its hyper-industrialization. The film seems to frown on the counterculture youth who throw a pseudo-protest party on Mount Fuji because they believe, quote, green pastures exist only in their minds. Faith is touched upon with Ken's belief that Godzilla will save them and eliminate pollution. There's a touch of nihilism in the collateral damage and deaths caused by the kaiju. This concludes part 1 of the podcast. You're listening to Kaijuvision Radio.
In part 2 of the podcast, we give our opinion and do some discussion on the film. So, what do you think of this one?
I like this one, but, pardon the pun, it's a strange beast.
I just unequivocally love it, actually. It's one of my favorite ones.
We have some very interesting stories about how we discovered this movie, I think. We saw it at 2 very different points in our fandom. I saw it back in the early days when I was a teen, but you didn't see it until much more recently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was within the past 3 years, I think. I got the Blu-ray of it, and I knew it was going to be quite a ride, but I didn't think it was going to be as good as it turned out to be. I actually ended up loving it right from the very first minutes of it.
Yeah, I discovered it actually at a small town video store, and I came across this one. I had never seen it anywhere else, mostly because that VHS was out of print for many, many years, and had this very unusual painted cover, and I said, I have to take this home and see it. And the other cool thing was that video store was also next to a comic shop, so it was the perfect spot for me. It really was unlike anything I had seen. It was just so strange. But I really enjoyed it despite the strangeness. Actually, I probably liked it because of the strangeness.
I like it because it's very much, it's almost like it's an independent film.
It's probably the most like an independent film out of anything in the franchise, really.
This is one of the movies that I would classify as a hybrid film because it has components of like 3 different other movies in it, namely the original, and then also there's a little bit of Ebirah, the Horror of the Deep going on in it stylistically, and then also All Monsters Attack.
Yeah, because it's got stuff from all of those, because it has young people, it has a kid, and
it's got the seriousness.
It's got the seriousness
with the people actually dying part.
Yeah, and a very potent message.
And then also
up at the forefront.
The setting is actually between this kid's family and the kid's family from the previous movie. They live in very similar circumstances almost.
Yeah, most definitely. It's kind of funny. that in this movie, in the Japanese version, we actually have a kid named Ken, and the name Kenny has been associated with the kids that show up in the Gamera movies. And it's the term a Kenny has become this term in the fandom referring to obnoxious kid characters in kaiju movies. But the funny thing is that it's only in the dub version of the original Gamera where the kid's named Kenny.
Oh yeah.
I just thought it was funny. I saw a video where this guy was riffing on this movie and made the joke about how, oh yeah, great, now the kid actually is named Ken.
Yeah, that's true. I don't know how weird this movie is though. Really, I mean, I think a lot of people overestimate how weird this movie is. There's some weird stuff in it, but for the time that it was made, it's really revolutionary, but it's also indicative of the kind of movies and television that was being released at the time. Late 60s, early 70s had a lot of Hedorah, Hedorah has a lot of that going on, and it was very current.
I still think that this is very much a testament to Yoshimitsu Banno, the director of this film. He ended up making something that was unlike anything that had been seen up to that point in the franchise, and I'm not sure there's really been a Godzilla film that comes close to what we got in this too. I mean, as you said, it's the most like an independent movie out of all of them, and it's also possibly the only counterculture Godzilla film in the franchise as well.
Although I think at the end of the day, it's actually a pretty conservative movie.
I would agree with you there.
Banno was able to get all of the coolest things to do in movies at the time, and he was able to distill all of those elements into this movie. I do credit him with that. He did a great job at being able to give us the best of what was going on at the time.
He's very much a visionary, I would say. He was trying a lot of very different things in this. Just how the movie is shot, there's some very interesting points where you have like these Hedorah POV shots when Godzilla's punching at him, and they look really cool. They're only on screen for about a second or two at a time, but unfortunately, I don't think he got as much love for a long time as he should have.
Probably not, which is it's unfortunate. Which, if you look it up, you'll find the story about how his work wasn't looked at as very good by some of the people actually in the studio. But well, that's what happens. But I think he was very ahead of his time. I think he probably just got punished for that.
Yeah.
This is one of the best time capsule type of movies ever made, ever. This movie is one of the most daring, bold movies I've seen. It is so different. It's so different from all the other movies that we'd seen before this. We know Terry Gilliam had to have seen this movie. There's no question about it. And this movie is very experimental too. I mean, for instance, all these animations, like you said, and then all the drawings. It's very, very unique, special. I would have loved to have seen this in a movie theater at the time it was made. If I had been like this age right now, back then, it would have been incredible.
Hedorah himself is also a very different opponent for Godzilla than what had been seen before, with his constant metamorphosing, the fact that he is a space monster like Ghidorah, but originally was a microscopic life form that constantly mutated.
Yeah, and then it just goes macro, and then it...
Yeah, and the only monster I can think of who comes even remotely close, and only in one aspect, and that is Mothra, but only because Mothra metamorphoses, but she doesn't go through nearly as many forms as Hedorah does.
No, there's just the given metamorphosis with because it's a moth.
Yeah.
But with this, it's like way more complicated.
And it's such a way out there design. That was another one of the defining characteristics of the 70s Godzilla films, was Godzilla's opponents started to become more fantastical. They weren't just glorified animals or dinosaurs anymore. They were becoming more bizarre. They were becoming stranger.
And because they're running out of ideas. There are only so many monster ideas that are, original enough. And so I think by the time the 70s came around, it's like, what else are we going to do? We don't know. And then they have to go further outside the box every time that they invent a new one.
But that's one of the things I actually really enjoy about this particular era was seeing how broad their imagination could get with their concepts of these creatures.
Is very original. Is pretty simple actually, because the Hedorah character is an extended metaphor for pollution. And it's very, in that way, it's actually quite simple. Also, just as a note, though, I mean, 330-pound costume for Hedorah.
Gosh, which you can tell. I mean, that costume is massive, and it's bulbous, and it's just...
Count me out of that. No way.
I mean, that means that costume outweighed him. I mean, you have to be strong to carry that.
Yeah, amazing. I have no idea how. I don't think I'd be able to do that for very long.
The design of Hedorah is just...
You can tell somebody put some time into actually figuring out what the monster is. And then all these different forms that it takes.
Well, and the thing that's interesting is I noticed that they really paid attention to little details, because if you notice, Hedorah is kind of glittery, and it's because he has a lot of minerals composing him. So I thought that was a nice visual way of communicating that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the suit is amazing.
I think Hedorah would actually be a creature that I would love to see brought back in a modern film, particularly a modern, like say a big budget Hollywood film, because I think they could do some really interesting things with Hedorah's composition and the animation. Make it
CGI Hedorah, you mean?
A CGI Hedorah, where like the sludge is always moving around constantly,
you could really do anything you
undulating
want.
And all of that.
Yeah, you could do anything you want. You could have somebody like mocap it.
Yeah.
And then just CGI all that stuff in.
But
make it look really incredible.
Yeah, but I just think that the textures and everything would just look visually very interesting. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, I don't think Hedorah is as high on the list of Toho creatures to bring back in the MonsterVerse.
When that first Nintendo game for Godzilla came out, is the one you just go to
Monster of Monsters.
That's when you would go to all the different planets, and in the Jupiter level, the final boss is Hedorah, because there's like a new monster each planet you go to, blah blah blah. But then I remember at the time I was like, "What's that? What's a Hedorah?"
Yeah,
and then finally later on I just got to figure that out. But I was like, what? But looking at it in the game, I couldn't tell what it was at all. It was just this blob thing with the kind of arm thing that came out every once in a while, and then it would throw this stuff at you, and I'm like, what is it throwing at me? What are these blob things? Is this like just a blob monster or what?
It's interesting that you bring that up, calling him a blob monster, because there's a scene in the movie where Hedorah is crawling across a highway, but we don't realize that immediately. It's just we have a couple of the characters sitting in their car, and suddenly this black ooze starts coming across the windshield, and they look around and they realize it's Hedorah crawling across, and he's consuming the car, so they jump out, start running, but they barely get out before it's completely covered in the sludge. And it reminded me of The Blob with Steve McQueen from back in the 50s.
Yeah, it heavily does recall that kind of imagery in that one particular scene there. But getting to particular scenes, I mean, there's a ton of these that are so amazing. It starts out with this, what did you just say? Some people think it looks like a Bondian beginning with the singer and the
crazy imagery in the background.
All the stuff going on visually during this.
It's a very James Bondian sort of opening.
It's almost like a music video.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah. As much as there, the people in the fandom who love this movie really love it, and the ones who don't really don't. So it's kind of polarizing, but it still has left an indelible mark on the fandom. And the original English version, the AIP dub, they made a new version of the theme song, because in the Japanese the song is called Return the Sun, and I did find a translation of the lyrics online, but they made this new song that was to the same music and the same tune, and the singer in English even sounds exactly the same as the Japanese singer.
Very much so. Pretty close.
They made this new song. It's called Save the Earth. The title of that song actually gets recycled later. We talked about the old NES Godzilla game. There was one about 10 years ago on the PS2 and the original Xbox that was called Godzilla Save the Earth. So that's how much of an impression that this song made. Now, I can tell you that the English lyrics for this are there. It's not a translation of Return the Sun, but the lyrics are very much in the same spirit.
Same message.
Same sort of message. Unfortunately, the DVD and Blu-ray releases do not include the song. They have the international dub that had been commissioned by Toho and not the AIP dub. You can find the original sequence on YouTube, or if you really want to be crazy, you can track down that out-of-print VHS if you want to watch it with the AIP dub, which, from what I understand, is the better of the dubbings. Ken in this movie we have another Godzilla fanboy.
Right.
In this. That's the other thing that's really interesting about this. We have 2 movies in a row.
A bit of a weird connection to Godzilla too.
Yeah.
It's almost like a psychic.
Yeah. But it's just interesting because you have 2 movies in a row where we have that feature kids prominently, and they're both Godzilla fanboys, and both have to do with dreaming. Whereas with the
Some
last
sort of
movie,
dreaming or
with the last movie, it was the crux of the entire. One of the cruxes of the entire movie. And this one, it's just one sequence where this kid, it sounds like he's reading a school report. Yeah. It's a voiceover. He's doing a voiceover of him reading a school report, but it's him dreaming of Godzilla showing up and destroying all of, at least Japan's pollution. I don't know about all the pollution in the world, but destroying pollution.
It's funny how we see Hedorah immediately in the movie. Like,
yeah, they don't waste any time.
Even in the title sequence, we get to see the head right there. But then Hedorah shows up immediately once the titles are over too. Like with our child protagonist is on the shore, and his father is going down in the water and stuff, and then Hedorah flies directly over him. Puts the knife up and stabs it, and it just goes through all the sludge. And
which actually serves to. It serves a story point because it helps to show you what kind of a creature that Hedorah is and show you that he's impervious to most forms of attack.
Yeah, but we definitely don't have a situation where the monster shows up an hour into the movie.
No.
The timing's nice and immediate for us. To start getting used to this very interesting, multifaceted kaiju.
Yeah, and Godzilla doesn't waste much time showing up either. It's actually one of the fastest times that he shows up. I actually timed it. I think it's about 12 to 13 minutes into the movie.
There's one part at 11:45 in, and we get that first cartoon animation thing, and Hedorah is drinking from the oil tankers.
Yes.
That it's incredibly cool. But like this whole animation style, that was very indicative of the time. There was a lot of cartoons that were coming out that had this same look and the same kind of tone. About 19 minutes and 10 seconds in, we get our 70s music at the club. And that it makes the dance competition in Hedorah, it makes that look totally square.
Yeah, that might be arguably the trippiest sequence in the entire movie.
Yeah, the trippiest sequence is at 25:18. And that's when we get our Terry Gilliam moment with everyone in the club with their heads looking like
fish.
Like fish.
What was he
There's
drinking?
Totally, there's a scene in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas that totally is going on. It's totally the same thing. It has to be a reference. We know that Terry Gilliam had to have seen this. We know that his mind works about the same way as this movie works. But there's a scene in Fear and Loathing, if you've seen that's what where we're going with it. But it's definitely one of the weirdest things in any Godzilla movie ever.
Yeah, seriously.
Especially considering it doesn't have anything to do with the monsters. It's in the human plot.
Yeah. What was he drinking? There had to have been something in that stuff.
I don't know.
Because that would have been my thought. That he even seemed to have that kind of look on his face, like, what did I just drink?
Yeah, why am I seeing this?
Why am I seeing this?
It's funny, like he actually was surprised at it though, and so he wasn't planning to see something like this.
Yeah, and then you had all those go-go dancers and his girlfriend in that crazy outfit. Some sort of bizarre cat suit that looked like it was sort of flesh-colored and then covered with all these designs that you could almost say were tattoos.
She was doing her Miley Cyrus impression.
Yeah, it was except no twerking, thank God. But it was so weird. I had no idea how to react to it. It almost doesn't even seem to really have anything to do with the rest of the movie. It's just there. But there's a lot of things like that in this movie.
Well, we had to have the rude awakening at the club, though. That part.
Yeah,
was great.
definitely. It plays into that.
It all comes down the stairs, and they all are completely thrown back, and everybody stops what they're doing, and they just
suddenly
stand there, and then they look at the poor little kitty that's on the steps.
Oh, that poor cat. Yeah. I felt so sorry. I have a distinct memory of watching this movie on VHS, and my mom, who absolutely loves cats, walked in at that point in the movie, and I remember her saying, "Oh, poor kitty."
Yeah, it was really well shot, pretty convincing image.
I wonder how many of the people in that club were thinking they were still on drugs at that point.
You wouldn't want to be on drugs at that point, because then all this stuff just totally kills your buzz, like all of them had theirs killed.
Oh, yeah. Now, when I said Godzilla shows up about 12, 13 minutes in, I've read a lot of stuff, a lot of commentators pointing out that shot when Godzilla comes on screen, they have argued that it's meant, since he's being silhouetted against a setting sun, they are arguing that it's meant to be indicative of the Japanese flag because of the sun on there, saying that, Godzilla is Japan's hero. And I thought that was a very interesting take on things.
He is the hero, for sure.
Yeah, but it's like making him very distinctly, this is Japan's hero.
Well, I think in this movie, Godzilla does represent the Japanese national spirit.
I would agree with you there.
And it comes from a conservative direction where it's like, we only have this much land in Japan. We have to take care of it. That's a pretty, it's about protecting the homeland and protecting your culture's homeland, really. And so I think that's where the environmentalist part is partially coming from. It's just like I said in Japan, there are a lot of movements in Japan that are from the rest of the world, but Japan often tends to do them a little bit more conservatively. At about 30 minutes and 36 seconds into the movie, we get that another animation, and it's the factory that's eating up all the plant life.
And it has little eyes on it, and the big
and then little
claw
arms.
machine hands coming out.
And the factory goes bigger and bigger, and then the pollution draws Hedorah to it, and then Hedorah starts flying, and it's so amazing. Then we get whacked upside the head with the actual real effects of Hedorah, the deaths and the injuries. At about 37 minutes and 42 seconds in, Ken calls his father, and literally all hell breaks loose. Ken's on the phone in the phone booth, and he's extremely directly threatened by the explosions. The shock of all the explosion blows this phone booth apart.
Shatters the glass.
Yeah, and then his mom, who's leading the exercise group, Hedorah goes over them, and then they all fall to the ground. And then showing the kid running by the corroded jungle gym as he tries to get to safety. I mean, that was very effective.
Yeah, the mom and those girls were the lucky ones. All they did was choke on those fumes.
Yeah, and then people getting outright murdered by the pollution, and Ken seeing the skeletons on the ground, and then his eyes start hurting. Wow. And then that construction worker.
That was the most disturbing one for me.
Yeah, and so we end up with 1,600 people killed and 30,000 injured. And so it's, wow. People who
They're
weren't
actually putting numbers to this.
Yeah, people who weren't expecting anything serious, because a lot of these haven't been serious lately, for the most part. All of a sudden we get this, and it's like, wow.
I had forgotten about that construction worker when I rewatched this recently.
It's one of the most memorable parts. Very amazing.
I was just like, oh my gosh. He jumps off of the building. He sees Hedorah coming. It's not because he succumbed to the fumes. He jumps before he gets there. And unfortunately, it reminds me of about stories from 9/11, hearing about people jumping out of the window there just in sheer panic.
Yeah.
What was going on.
Yeah, and because the flames were coming to
I
them.
know, and it's just, oh, man. And then to make it even worse, we actually see what happened to the guy after he jumped. He dissolved on the way down.
Mm-hmm.
My gosh. Thanks, movie.
Yeah.
Nightmare fuel.
And then we have two other really effective animations going on. We get the one with the people breathing through the breathing masks. And it was people, all the masks were being sold, anti-Hedorah gas masks and yada, yada, yada. And then,
that might be actually the most disturbing animation out of all of them.
And then the one that it's about nuclear fission, and it explains nuclear fission. And
yeah,
it
subtly
explains how Hedorah actually has nuclear power.
Yeah, which is very bizarre. At that point, it felt like it was almost turning into an educational film.
Well, it turns into an education / advocacy. Public service announcement on drugs or something.
Yeah, which actually makes sense because I think I read someplace that Bano, his background was with documentaries, and
Makes
I think
sense.
it shows in that.
I think the two of the most absolutely effective parts are at 46 minutes and 35 seconds in, and the other one is at 47 minutes and 20 seconds in. And they're I think they're some of the greatest parts of any Godzilla movie. All the people who are on all these little TV screens, and then it gets composited and then composited more, and all these people who are casted in a situation that they can't control, meaning the pollution. There's nothing they can do about it. And they are expressing their frustration at all these massive problems. It's very powerful. It's very indicative of the times and the way movies were made back then. And then, back then, pollution was everywhere, and everyone wanted a way to get rid of it because it was making people sick. But it really accentuates how frustrated the public must have been at that point.
And if you pay attention to those individual screens in that sequence, there's some very weird things and imagery in a lot of those. Mm-hmm. I think the one that stands out the most, some of it is they're actually showing scenes from the movie, and then a lot of it is people talking and yelling, and it sounds like they're trying to yell over each other, even though it's individual screens.
Mm-hmm.
But the one that was the weirdest was there was one of a crying baby, and it looked like it was surrounded by mud
the sludge
or something,
or
sludge.
Uh-huh.
And I just thought, what?
Well, I mean,
it's so weird.
Oh, it's not weird. It's very
I think
effective.
It is very effective because I think what it's trying to get across is that
what kind
pollution
of world do we want our children to grow up in?
Yeah, and it's saying that that pollution's victims are as small as a baby.
Yeah, everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then Ken's uncle decides to do something really stupid, which is, at least according to this movie, is really stupid. He plans a party to demonstrate against pollution, and they end up accomplishing nothing, and then a whole lot of them get killed, including Ken's uncle. The movie's teaching us a pretty savage lesson about activism here, isn't it? It's a big
very
indictment of the
satire.
movement, too. Yeah, and it's a pretty big indictment of the movement. Everything they do is ineffective and symbolic, and then Hedorah just goes and, kills them?
Yeah, he was originally organizing it as this rally, this demonstration against pollution, and then they wanted 1 million youth there, 1 million kids, and there was about 100.
Mm-hmm.
And so he just decides, well, we'll have a party because it's kind of a eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow you die.
Well, and the thing
sort
is,
of a mentality.
What actually happened in Japan was, in order to get rid of this pollution, what actually was the saving grace of everything? It was legislation. The Diet passed a whole bunch of laws, and so then the pollution got a lot better. And I think all the activists, they didn't have anything really to do with that. And instead, it was legislation that actually did something. And
it's interesting looking at the scene when they're presenting that stylistically, because it's actually in black and white, showing you all the kids on Mount Fuji and they're just hanging around doing nothing. And while he's just playing a little bit on his guitar, and then someone says something like, "Oh, nobody showed up," and then he strums it. And as he strums it, it goes back to color, and it says, "Well, we're just going to throw a party."
Yeah.
It's a very interesting choice stylistically, and I think it's meant to be ironic and another part of a rather biting satire.
Yes, it's pretty cynical.
Yeah, I can't help but wonder. I mean, we've talked a bit in the last couple of episodes about student demonstrations, and now watching this movie, knowing about all of the student movements that had gone on just a few years before this, I can't help but wonder if maybe that was in the back of the filmmakers' minds with these kids. That's why they're making such a satirical commentary on what they're doing.
Yeah, in a way, this movie is almost playing the part of the old fogey that's just, you hippies, get a haircut and stuff.
Yeah, I've actually heard some people refer to these youth characters as Japanese hippies, which
pretty much are.
They pretty much are.
Yeah, and then we get to watch Ken's uncle get brutally Hedorah to death. But then from that point on, from about 52 minutes and 22 seconds, then the whole movie becomes really fascinating to look at, even more so. The Hedorah Kaiju is definitely so interesting. It changes forms, and it's throwing sludge at Godzilla. It's even shooting a ray
from its eye.
Yeah, and the way Hedorah moves around and how Hedorah behaves, it's so interesting to look at. The way that Hedorah moves around and the way it mysteriously does all these interesting attacks on Godzilla.
I think Hedorah's got a bit of a sadist streak in him because he laughs at Godzilla's suffering during their battles.
Yeah, it does.
I think he takes quite a bit of pleasure in it. You can tell that there is a certain level of intelligence with Hedorah.
Yeah,
even though he originally
being a cosmically sourced monster.
Yeah, even though he originally showed up on Earth as a microscopic organism.
Mm-hmm. But it's really cool how Godzilla uses his mind to figure out how to defeat Hedorah, because it's like Godzilla has to think his way through the problem. And it's the way our human characters have to.
Yeah, and actually that accounts for, I think, a lot of the decisions that they made with how the kaiju battles in this are staged, because the battles in this are a little bit slower paced, not quite as intense, a little more plotting, but I think it's the nature of Hedorah, because Hedorah can't move around that fast, and also because Godzilla's normal modes of attack don't work. Mm-hmm. So that's why he spends a lot of time
pretty early on in the movie we get to notice that nothing Godzilla normally does works.
Yeah, and that's
punches through it and nothing happens.
Yeah, and that's why there's a lot of parts in the movie where you just see Godzilla just kind of posturing and always remaining at a kind of a combative stance. Like, I can't go after this thing, but
Godzilla reacts a whole lot.
Yeah.
You can see Godzilla react to all these weird things that Hedorah's doing.
Yeah. And might I add, Hedorah is the most disgusting opponent Godzilla has ever fought. And not just in terms of the fact that he's made out of sludge, but even some of the sound effects that they use for Godzilla's attacks.
Yeah, it's pretty gross.
They're
gross
absolutely gross. It's waiting for a bunch of crude jokes to be made. And I can admit they were going through my head when I was watching it. It's just disgusting. Actually, I think I can remember showing this movie to some friends when I was younger, and I think they were making the disgusting jokes.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, ugh. Yeah, especially that scene when Godzilla's in that hole and Hedorah's trying to drown him in mud. That he just
sludge or whatever.
That he just drops out of himself into there, and I'm just like, God, that is just disgusting to think about.
Well, there's a lot to clean up on the set after.
Oh, I bet. I would love to know how they did a lot of that. I want to know how they did that pit sequence, because I bet you Nakajima wasn't having fun at that point.
No, it doesn't look like a lot of fun. It's amazing how many of these Nakajima did. Just one after the other for so long.
That's because Nakajima is hardcore.
At about 59:07 into the movie, this is one of my favorite moments. Godzilla moves his tail, and he touches this rock, and moves this rock. And then Hedorah gets distracted. And then we get that wonderful shot of Godzilla punching right into the camera lens, which was supposed to be Hedorah's eye.
I love that.
Technique-wise, that is so incredibly cool. It's very short too, but it press pause or something when you see that. I mean, it's really cool to look at. I almost want a poster that looks like that.
Oh, with that image. It'd be a great screensaver.
It'd be a great GIF, too. Somebody needs to make a GIF.
When MTV in 1998 gave Godzilla a Lifetime Achievement Award, they used that as part of the video montage for him.
It's good to use in any Godzilla montage.
Oh, yeah, it is. And I have to admit, when I saw that sequence, the first thing that went through my mind was, you put your eye out, kid.
Yeah.
Actually, I think for Godzilla, it was well-deserved retribution because Hedorah had spat some sludge in his face and it blinded him in one eye. So I think he was just going for Hedorah's eye and saying, see, now it's even.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because Godzilla got a lot of stuff thrown at him. That like all this burning sludge and stuff. A lot of really good effects.
Yeah. Did you catch that there was a nice little Japanese pop culture reference in the movie? Godzilla does the Ultraman pose.
Oh, yeah.
When he crosses his arms, when Hedorah fires the laser beam at him, and he does that. That's the Ultraman pose.
Yeah.
When Ultraman fires his, I think it's called the Specium Ray. It's his finishing move. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was great. I think that was just a little joke that Nakajima had come up with on set to do. And then it's like he does it, and then his hand gets hit by the laser, and he's like, ow! Yeah. But it makes sense because Nakajima played a lot of the monsters that Ultraman fought in the original Ultraman show. Yeah. So, and he probably figured there's going to be kids watching this, so he threw that in there as a nice little reference for them. Brian, what do you think were those white spheres that Godzilla rips out of Hedorah toward the end there? When I was younger and I watched it, I think my dad or my mom, one or the other, thought that they were eggs. I've heard some people say it's supposed to be Hedorah's eyes, even though they look red when they're in his body.
I think it was the eyes.
That's
because like he picks them up and has one in each hand, and then the one has like a dent in it. And I think that's where it's to indicate that that's the one that Godzilla punched. So I think that's, and like the eyes are the only thing that isn't sludge. In Hedorah, I mean, supposedly. And so, I just assumed it was eyes.
Yeah, I just remember that being another piece of the weirdness of this movie when I was watching it, as a younger fan. I just thought, what in the world are those things?
Yeah, it's like if you make a Hedorah costume or whatever, you're going to have the eyes as a big part of it, but then the rest of it's just going to be an amalgamation of sludge-related matter. But yeah, I think it was the eyes. Well, it's like a video game where you kill the boss and then the boss comes back. Yeah. This is like one of the earliest times that we get to see you have defeated the boss, now for boss level 2.
Yeah.
3 even, depending on what game you're at.
Oh, and that's something you see a lot, particularly in Japanese video games, the multi-form bosses. Mm-hmm. It's ridiculous. I was like, haha, you have beat me. Nope, here is my true form.
Yeah, now I'm going to turn into something a lot harder to defeat. Haha.
It's like, and you just stop and think, why did you do this at the start?
Yeah. I think it's hilarious how people get so bent out of shape over Godzilla flying at the end. As if the rest of the scenes with Godzilla and Hedorah in this movie were serious. Because they're not. Most of these scenes that Godzilla has with Hedorah, there's quite a bit of expression and quite a bit of humor in them. So it didn't really catch me as something that I would get upset about. I guess it's a good way to entertain the audience at the end, because you want to have something fun at the end, because you've been going through this movie and with all this heavy messaging, and so I think that's why they put it in there.
Bano stated that it was included in the movie as comic relief to lighten things up, because it's a very dark movie.
Just along with the military incompetence.
Yeah.
And how nothing they do seems right or ends up working.
Did you know that was coming before you watched it? Because it's something that gets talked about a lot in the fandom. When I watched the movie, I had no idea it was coming. Absolutely no idea.
I think I did. I don't know. I thought it was just funny. I think that's how the audience reacted when they saw it.
I wish I could remember how I responded to it the first time that I saw this movie. I can't You would think I would remember, but I can't really think of it. It didn't turn me against the movie like it's done for a lot of people. But I probably reacted to it the same way I did the whole rest of this movie. It's just like, this is just weird. It's very strange. It goes down, honestly, as probably one of the top 5 biggest WTF moments in the entire franchise.
I don't know if you treat it seriously, it is, but I don't treat it seriously. Like, it's just comic relief at the end.
I think what it is a lot of fans look at this movie and they feel like the tone is kind of all over the place, because at points it's dark and disturbing, and at other points it's surreal and strange, and then it decides to be funny and goofy.
But it does so with a major purpose, though. Mm-hmm. And but if you consider that the film is coming from an environmentalist lesson teaching direction, then really the tone's spot on, because it's talking about the seriousness of how bad all this pollution stuff is, which totally plugs into what was going on in society at the time. And so I don't know. I don't think it's a matter of tone. I think it's the purpose of the movie. It has its own tone.
This concludes part 2 of the podcast. On to related topics.
You're listening to Kaijuvision Radio. In part 3 of the podcast, we talk about some related topics that either the movie brought up in the film itself or was going on in Japan at the time the film was released. So for this one, we have the environmentalist movement in Japan, which was brought on by all of the pretty radically high amount of pollution that Japan was able to cultivate during mostly the 60s, when all of this hyper-industrialization occurred. Before this, though, we've had a number of things going on in the world that, even far back to the 50s, about pollution actually killing people, just like in this movie is depicted quite a bit. There was the Great Smog of London, and that happened in 1952, and it killed 12,000 people. This kind of thing was very real. And then also New York had a very bad smog issue, and it killed people too. And then also, currently, I think probably one of the biggest ones would be Mongolia, because there is just a giant amount of pollution, and their economy is pretty dated. It's not very high tech, and they burn a lot of coal, and they burn a lot of other stuff, and the pollution is getting so bad that people are protesting in the streets about it, because their children and infants are getting these just hellacious respiratory diseases, and that's really tragic to see. Babies, practically, infants getting so sick from just breathing the air. Another one would definitely be the Bhopal disaster in India, which was extremely bad. But look that up too. And then in America, we have the whole Rachel Carson's Silent Spring phenomenon going on, which, partially a little bit of that was actually propaganda. But the government failed to regulate pollution as it increased. And so you have parts of society that aren't concerned about those kind of issues, and then all of a sudden it keeps getting worse. And so it's just like from All Monsters Attack, where you have society on the whole. It's like something with society went wrong. Just like in All Monsters Attack, where this very industrial landscape that the kids have to grow up in. And then with this, we get a lot of the same thing. It's a directional thing where it seems like society is on the wrong track and we need to fix things. There was a lot of pollution in Japan, though, particularly, and it was very concentrated at times too. And there are 4 different diseases that actually came out of this.
Yeah, the 4 pollution diseases of Japan. Although one of them was actually pre-war. It was called the Itai disease, which means it hurts, because the victims of this disease were suffering from a lot of chronic pain, and were often crying out because of how much pain they were in. It occurred in 1912, and it was actually because of cadmium poisoning. That was in drinking water in the Jinsugawa River. It had been dumped there by the Mitsui Mining and Smelting Company. The victims suffer from debilitating pain, as I had mentioned, bone fractures from mild trauma. They could break bones just from doing stuff like coughing. That is a kind of a horrific thing to think about. That's how brittle their bones were. And then they had anemia, bone deformities, and kidney disorders. Stay away from cadmium is all I can say. A big one was the Minamata disease.
Yeah.
Yeah, which afflicted people in the city of Minamata in the Kumamoto prefecture in 1956. It was caused by the ingestion of fish from Minamata Bay contaminated with methyl mercury, which attacked the central nervous system and
neurological stuff. Yeah.
People were suffering from numbness in arms and legs, impairment of balance, fatigue, ringing in the ears, tunnel vision, deafness, and even slurred speech. They could even communicate.
Mm-hmm.
Many patients even went insane because of all of this and died within a month.
Yeah, mercury is,
it's nasty.
In heavy doses can do all that.
Yeah, it's nasty. There was a lot of research done to try to figure out what exactly was the cause of it, and the most likely culprit seemed to be the Chiso Corporation, which had been dumping the methyl mercury out into the water. And then you had another case of Minamata disease in the Niigata prefecture in 1965, but that one was much more contained because it had been detected early, thankfully.
Yeah, the one in Kumamoto was 35 plus years that they were dumping mercury into the wastewater. Yeah.
Yeah, that one they couldn't quite figure out what the cause of it was. There's been a lot of research done trying to figure it out, and it's believed that the most likely cause was the Showa Denko factory on the Agano River. They had been dumping the mercury in there.
But, chemical plant, right?
Yeah. But the one that's most pertinent actually to the film, as we mentioned in part 1, is Yokkaichi. Yokkaichi is a city at the center of the Miyagi prefecture. It's called the Town of Petroleum because there's a lot of oil refineries there. Oil refineries started being constructed there in 1955 and then again in 1963 because at that point Mitti and Prime Minister Ikeda were trying to move Japan away from coal and transition to petroleum. And since most of the oil that they were getting came from the Middle East, there was a lot of sulfur in it, approximately 2% sulfur, which created white smog all over the city. And because of that, there was a huge outbreak of respiratory diseases, bronchitis, emphysema, stuff like that.
Asthma.
Yeah, this is called Yokkaichi asthma.
Mm-hmm.
Think of it like this. In non-polluted areas, you had about 3% of the population was being afflicted with bronchitis, whereas in Yokkaichi, 5 to 10% of the population aged 40 was suffering from bronchitis.
Yeah, it's about 3 times as much.
Yeah, it's crazy. They tried to correct this by having taller smokestacks, and I can't believe anyone thought that this would actually work, because all it ended up doing was spreading the toxin
farther.
Spreading it farther. It's like, you didn't think about this. How is making these taller supposed to make this stuff go away?
Rather ridiculous, actually.
I don't understand. I mean, that's a multi-million-dollar mistake right there. I don't know.
Sounds like more of a stalling tactic, if anything.
Yeah, and think of it like this. This got so bad, and it's gone on for so many years, that a class action lawsuit was actually filed against the Showa Yokkaichi Oil Company. It had 544 people. It was adjudicated in September of 1970, just a year before this movie was released. And the numbers have only continued to increase over the years. And studies have been done and found out that there was a 10 to 20-fold increase in COPD and asthma mortality rates in Yokkaichi compared to the rest of the population.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
This is nasty. And the term Yokkaichi asthma is now a term that is being used for similar ailments across the world now. Because they've diagnosed things like this in places like Mexico City and mainland China. And it was yokaiji specifically, and seeing the suffering of that city and what had become of it because of all of this, that inspired Banno to make this movie.
Term.
Yeah. Considering that this is what was going on in Japan at the time, these high-profile pollution incidents, I am not surprised that it led to something like this.
Yeah, and also the year before this movie was released, that was when the EPA was founded. It was in the 1970, and then 1971 was when the Japanese government formed an equivalent. And then I believe it was somewhere around the 90s that the EPA equivalent in Japan was actually raised to a cabinet-level position, as opposed to just a department.
Well, that would make sense, given what was going on.
Yeah, it was an agency, but now it's like an actual department. Coming from Indiana, I mean, we've had some experience with pollution in our state, too. I mean, for one, you have Gary.
Oh, Gary.
Pollution and like all the stuff up in the region, as it's called, the northwest corner of Indiana, which is outside of Chicago. There's a lot of pollution there.
Gary's a scary place.
Down in South Indiana, though, like southern Indiana, there is more pollution than in northern Indiana, and a lot of it is because of coal.
Yeah.
And Indiana is not very lucky because Indiana has some of the highest sulfur content of coal in the coal of almost any state, I think. I mean, it's very, very dirty coal is what it's classified as. Just very dirty. It's not clean at all. It's a lot of stuff that gets released into the atmosphere. And I remember when I was in Bloomington, I just parked my car outside. I didn't have a garage at that point. And there were some mornings that I would wake up and I'd go to my car to go to class. And then there would be this layer of soot on top of the car. And it was because they fired up the coal power plant on campus at night, and then they burned it at night. And so that was why when I went to the car, there was all this soot all over it. And part of it was, sulfur from the fact that the coal is just so extremely dirty. Actually, in Indiana, one of the most polluting coal power plants in the nation is in Indiana, and it's in Rockport, which is just outside of Evansville, or pretty close to it. And there was a report recently where we saw on the news that there are parents that are going to the doctors and saying that their kids have asthma and that they're getting sick and that they, sometimes are gasping for breath, just because once you get the combo of not very much wind, hot weather, and then people being outside, that's just a bad idea. And so we have to get a lot of these ozone warnings and everything. I mean, it's just not optimal.
It actually sounds a bit like yokaiji asthma, almost.
Yeah, I mean, coal is really, even so-called clean coal, it's really, really dirty, and you just don't want to be breathing it. I mean, that goes back also to coal miners who get black lung. Again, not something you want to have. Coal is definitely not a form of energy that you want to use, but is more something that you have to use because you need it. And instead, there are a lot of alternatives, natural gas, solar, renewable, all the different renewables, but you want to try to avoid coal, especially if the coal is really dirty and has a lot of sulfur in it. That's just even worse. And so, yeah, it's even locally we have to deal with this.
It's just unfortunate that Japan was trying to transition from coal to petroleum, probably thinking it would be a better source of energy, and it still came with its own share of problems.
Yeah, and Japan, they're in a very tough situation just because they can't produce very much energy domestically. And so you just have like a sort of series of bad options, and none of them really seem all that enticing at all.
I can't remember if I've brought this up before in the podcast, but Japan very much is a nation of catch-22s, and energy is another one of those catch-22s because they can't really produce any energy themselves. They have to import it, which comes with its own drawbacks. And the one energy source that they were producing themselves was nuclear. And then the last 5-6 years or so, they've become very leery of nuclear energy now. They're shutting down nuclear power plants.
Yeah, a lot of them are not operational today still.
Yeah. So it's a very precarious position that they find themselves in. But the silver lining on this is not long after this film was released, Japan really started taking its pollution problem seriously and started remedying it.
Yeah, legislation was really what got a lot of the sulfur out of the air in Japan once it was done, and there were a lot of there was a whole session of the Diet where practically it was most of the laws that they passed that time were a lot of pollution regulations, and I think it was to get rid of some of the very worst of it for sure, and to get things to go in a better direction.
In fact, it worked out so well that I've read a few places where Japan and a lot of cities in Japan are actually considered to be some of the least polluted in the entire world now.
They've made a lot of progress,
and it's a very good thing, because the more I look into the pollution issues at this particular time, it's nasty. I can remember growing up in Indiana all my life, not nearby any huge cities, and always hearing about inner city pollution and things like smog and all of that. But it was always off in these giant cities like Los Angeles. Those always seem to be the ones that were having all of these major issues. So I was a little distant from the pollution problem. It was something I had to learn a bit more about as I grew up, to realize that it's not just limited to things like smog in big cities.
The other related topic that we have is the so-called Two Nixon Shocks, or Two Nixon Surprises, that occurred that Japan was very much affected by. The first one was when Nixon went to China. And so it was viewed that Nixon could actually be the only one to do this, because he was not so cozy with China to begin with, and that's what made it work. But he did a whole state visit, and it really, really caught the Japanese off guard, because they did not expect something like this, and they weren't really told about it either. They weren't told this really much in advance. And so the problem was that there had always been an agreement with the United States and Japan that China should not be, really messed around with.
That was the standard operating procedure, actually, at the time, was containing communism.
Yeah. And
that's why we were getting involved in things like the Korean and Vietnam Wars. The goal was to contain communism and keep it from spreading.
Yeah, and so when Nixon visited China, that just threw everything up into the air. The other Nixon shock was the United States decoupled the U.S. dollar from gold. And so that fixed exchange rate was gotten rid of, and then went to a floating exchange rate.
Yeah, there was a thing called the Bretton Woods system that had been set up in 1944 in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, by representatives from 44 different nations. And it created a fixed exchange rate that said that every ounce of gold was equivalent to $35 US. And Nixon didn't nullify it technically, but he rendered it pretty much void with his decision.
And also, at that time, the U.S. imposed a 10% surcharge on all imports into the United States. And that was the other part of the second Nixon shock was that. Because Japan's economy is so export-driven, and so then everything that Japan exports to the United States gets a 10% surcharge slapped on it, which makes those products more expensive, which is not in Japan's interest at all.
He also passed an executive order that froze prices and wages for 90 days, and this was the first time that there had been a government price control imposed. All of these actions were taken to combat inflation and unemployment, and also because of the increasing pressure from the rest of the world, because a lot of other nations had left the Bretton Woods system by this point. So the United States was one of those holdouts.
Yeah, and one of the results that occurred was that the Japanese yen went up in value compared to the US dollar. And that's something that the Japanese also want to avoid. And that is they want the exchange rate to be so that it's a lot more yen to a dollar rather than less yen to $1. And there's a term that we came across called endaka. And endaka just means a higher exchange rate between the yen and the dollar, and endaka is viewed as bad because it reduces the amount of exports that Japan can get away with, and so so endaka is generally a negative thing.
And think of it like this: right after Nixon made the announcement for this, Japan, the Bank of Japan, bought $1.3 billion to keep the exchange rate at 360 yen. But then its foreign exchange reserves increased to $4 billion within a few weeks. Also, think of it like this. In 1966, the United States had $13.2 billion in gold reserves, while all of the non-U.S. banks, so we're talking the rest of the world, had $14 billion. They had just a little bit more than the United States if you took the combined. That's how crazy this is. And only $3.2 billion of that gold in the U.S. reserves was foreign holdings. That's how much they had. So that should tell you something. That's why Bretton Woods was such a big deal. This Nixon shock initially seemed like a success, at least politically, for Nixon. The public saw it as protection against price gougers. The Dow jumped 33 points the day after the announcement was made, but it didn't really do anything to stave off the stagflation of the 1970s, and the dollar plunged. So the merits of this are debated quite a bit, even to this day, whether or not it was a good idea. And personally, just looking at it from a very surface level, I'm no economist, I'm not a financial expert, but it really honestly just seemed like it was a bad idea. Probably earned Nixon some immediate political points for at least a little while, but that's about all it really accomplished.
From a Japanese standpoint, it wasn't the currency revaluation as much as it was the 10% tax on imports, which that really also came out of left field, and they didn't like that at all in Japan. And especially when it's all imports, and you're just treating all imports as if they're the same thing, no matter what country they come from or what they are. It just, I think it didn't help with the relationship between the U.S. and Japan. And then the China thing as well. It just didn't, the Japanese weren't signing on to that very quick. Though we did have these two Nixon shocks, and the economy had to put up with those. However, the economic growth in 1971 was 4.69%, so still doing pretty well.
I hope that our related topics this time has helped to shed some light on what was going on in Japan and how it's a very idiosyncratic movie, but there are reasons that it exists, reasons why it was made. It's very important reasons, and so I'm hoping that now seeing what was going on at the time, can help you understand it just a little bit better. In which case, we here at Kaijuvision Radio would like to dedicate this episode in memory of Yoshimitsu Banno, who unfortunately died within the last year or so, and it's a tremendous loss. I don't think the guy really got the love that he deserved from the fans because he made such a strange movie, but it's very dividing for fans. But a lot of people are starting to find out more now is he never stopped loving Godzilla. He always had a great appreciation for the character and for the franchise, was always very proud of the work that he had done. And about 10 years ago, that passion really manifested again because he was over in Hollywood trying to get a new Godzilla movie produced, and through a lot of very interesting twists and turns that led him to Legendary Pictures, it became the 2014 film directed by Gareth Edwards, which then led to the Monsterverse. What I think fans need to stop and realize is that if not for Banno, we wouldn't be having this new kaiju renaissance that we're experiencing right now. Because without Godzilla 2014, there may have not been a Shin Godzilla, and then all the other films that are being produced now.
Yeah, he was one of the producers on Godzilla 2014, right?
Yeah, and it was that passion that he had that really inspired everyone at Legendary Pictures to make this movie happen. So losing him is a tremendous loss, I think, for the fandom. And I'm hoping that because of this, that fans will start to reevaluate Banno and his film. He was a fan just like all the rest of us and loved everything about Godzilla. So we can't fault him that. All right, let's close up shop here, shall we, Brian? Our next episode will be Godzilla vs. Gigan, a.k.a. Godzilla on Monster Island, released in 1972, and it's one that the both of us have been looking forward to.
Yeah, it happens to be my favorite film. If you listen to the introduction episode that was in there, I'm really looking forward to this.
If you'd like to get a hold of us and send us some feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Our email address is feedback@kaijuvision.com. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook.
Our podcast is available on Google Play, iTunes, Stitcher, Blueberry, TuneIn, Podcast Addict, our YouTube channel, and on our website, kaijuvision.com. Thanks to Audiophiliac for creating our theme and bumper music. www.fiverr.com/audiophiliac. If you like our podcast, please support us on Patreon. I'm Brian Scherschel, and I edited this podcast.
And I'm Nathan Marchand, and I'm the podcast webmaster. Sayonara!